Welcome to the session, Making the Most of Math Journals. In this session, we will be looking at how we can set up a successful math journal at the beginning of our school year and tips for keeping the journals successful and as a really effective tool throughout the school year. Our expected outcomes for today are to identify some strategies, tips, and tools for establishing math journals at the beginning of the school year, and explore some tips for making sure that these math journals are meaningful and that they don't just become a place where students scribble in them or the pages get crumpled up and they get shoved in the back of a student desk. The last expected outcome for today is we are going to look at some resources and some tools that we can incorporate into our math journals. So the first thing I typically do when I teach this session is I have teachers do a table talk about what they believe the purpose of math journals to be. They will usually talk about how they've used journals in the past and what they believe that overall purpose is. You can either pause the video at this point to discuss this, or you can look at the next slide and see what teachers across the county have said. So teachers typically say that math journals are a tool for further reference or a place where students can think through their ideas or record ideas, like if they're being given a meaningful math task or a problem of the day. I like what it says right here of refining ideas. That just means that a lot of times when teachers give a meaningful math task, they might have the students share with a partner how they'd solve a problem or share out with the class how they'd solve a problem, and then the students record in their journal. So that way the students have been given this opportunity to talk through it before recording in the journal, so they've already refined their thinking a little bit. The third bullet says to encourage metacognitive thinking. That's just that thinking about the thinking, so reflecting on what you understand or questions you might still have about a strategy that the teacher taught. The next bullet says to develop a pool of strategies with the class. This just means that if we are given a meaningful math task, for example, the students would solve it in their journals one way. Then the class would do a math talk or share out strategies for solving that problem. As the class shares out strategies, students could develop that pool or record other ideas of how to solve that problem within their journal. One of the biggest reasons why I like using journals is this next bullet, informing the teacher. A lot of times I'll walk into a classroom blind, not knowing the students at all, so I like to start off right away with giving the students a meaningful math task or a problem of the day to grapple with a little bit. They're recording their ideas in that journal, but I'm also being informed as a teacher where I need to go with that lesson. So what is the next step? What tool, what strategy should I introduce? Which goes right along with this bullet of guiding instruction. The last bullet is studying and reviewing concepts. I think a journal is a great tool to send home for students to review what they've learned throughout the unit. It's also a great tool for the parents because a lot of times parents might not understand a strategy or something mentioned in the homework, and the journal could serve as that tool to teach the parents and the students. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some tips and tools for setting up your math journals at the beginning of the year. First thing I wanted to mention are just some daily tools that you might want to have in your classroom. Right here I wanted to touch upon the idea of having colored pencils and using color. Research shows that when you incorporate color into something, it helps students with their long-term memory and it helps students remember and focus in on things. In fact, research shows that yellow helps students focus and green helps students remember. So typically when I have students highlight, I use either yellow or green. One way to incorporate this into your journal is when students are writing vocabulary words in their journal, have them highlight that word in yellow. So when they flip to that page or when they're flipping through their journal looking for that word, the yellow will help them focus right in on those vocabulary words. The other way that we could use colored pencils is to allow students to label their diagrams or label their illustrations or label their notes, so that that color not only helps them remember, but that color gives them that ownership, and the journal starts to just look a little bit better and the kids start to take pride in it a little bit more. Touching upon the colored pencils once more, though, I did want to say that this doesn't mean that you need to color everything. In fact, I would discourage coloring because that coloring takes away from that really useful time where you can get that good solid core instruction in. Here are a couple other tools that you want to have handy. One tool that I did want to talk about right here are the sticky notes. And I really like sticky notes, especially when we're doing meaningful math tasks, because I suggest doing a meaningful math task at the beginning of a lesson, letting the students grapple with it before the teacher goes into their lesson. But a lot of times students might not be completely 100% accurate when they are grappling, which is okay because we just want them to think through something. So after the students focus on that meaningful math task, the teacher would do that math talk to share out strategies and solutions. At that point, the students might hear something or might catch a mistake that they made or might realize they want to do something different or add on to their thinking. This is where I would have those sticky notes accessible, because I don't want students erasing in their journals, or I don't want students just adding on in pencil to their journals, because I don't know where they started versus where they wound up after I did some teaching. So I would have them record any new thinking on that sticky, slap the sticky note in their journal. This also helps for parent conferences, so the parents can see this whole progression of this is where the student started, but after I did some teaching, this is what they grasped. This also helps with the fact that if this is serving as a tool that goes home with the students, you don't want them to be studying from something that they solved incorrectly. So you want the students to really see what the correct answer is, or what a good efficient strategy is for solving a problem. The other reason why I like sticky notes, I've seen one teacher do a really good job of organizing her journals by unit, and she used sticky notes as a little tab or divider to separate the different units in math. The next tools that I would suggest having, either having a composition notebook, a spiral notebook, or this teacher used a binder. I thought the binder was a really neat tool because this way you can add papers to different sections or different areas of the binder as you go. There might be a section for notes, a section for problem solving, a section for tools, and you can just continuously go back and forth and add where you need to. Now this teacher, she used clear sleeve protectors to store her pages just so that they don't come out so easily. She was in a first grade class, so those pages could easily be ripped out. That's one of those things that's just preference. You might want to do that, you might not want to spend the money on those sleeve protectors. She also kept a spiral notebook in the back of their journals. This is where they did their problem solving. And then the first half of the journal was where she inserted the different tools for the students. This same teacher, she also liked the idea of using tabs or dividers to separate each part of the day so that everything ends up going into this journal so that the parents can see everything within the math block for each day of the week. I also like what she did. She chose to use the 3-ring binder versus composition notebooks. And again, that's just one of those things that you need to think about what would work best for you. 4th and 5th grade teachers that I had worked with recently were saying that notebooks would probably work better because they had been having attendance issues. And if they're having attendance issues, it's hard to figure out how many pages to skip in the composition notebook, getting students to go back and fill in those pages, versus if you have that notebook, it's easy to go back and just insert what you missed. Here was something else that I liked. This teacher was teaching about bar models, and I believe this was in 3rd grade. This teacher, anytime she did something, she just punched holes in the paper and it ended up getting inserted into the journal as a tool that the students referred back to. This is an example of a table of contents, and some teachers use table of contents differently depending on the grade and the situation. But this teacher, she just had the kids every day record the topic and the page number. Now this teacher did, prior to the beginning of the school year, go through the students' notebooks, and she used composition notebooks. She went through the notebooks and labeled every single page number of that journal ahead of time so that students could easily track the pages. While I've talked to other teachers and they said, well, really, I don't care if everybody has place value on page 11 or if they counted wrong, because as long as their table of contents says the right page, it's still an effective tool. Something else I've seen really done well is one teacher tabbed each unit within her composition notebook, her journals. She put a little sticky note for the tab, and each time she started a new unit, she started a new table of contents. So that made it really easy for the kids to figure out where they needed to go to figure out things related to fractions or related to geometry. This is an example of a glossary. I actually don't prefer to use glossaries, but if it works well for you, great. You can do a glossary at the end of your journal. What I've run into is I never know how much space to allocate for each letter of the alphabet. And then one time I tried, well, I'll just build my glossary as I go and I won't alphabetize, but then that gets messy as well. My suggestion is just to record the vocabulary within the unit as we go, because then that way if we know fractions is all in this section of the notebook, I can flip through, and if I'm using color to highlight my terms, I could easily still find the words that I'm looking for. So we just talked a little bit about setting up our journals for the school year. Then now we need to talk about, well, what happens at the beginning of the school year? We really have to set up strong expectations for these journals if we're going to want them to be a really good, effective tool throughout the year. My biggest suggestion is making the kids feel that ownership of the journal. So on day one, if you're using a composition notebook, have the kids decorate the inside page or the cover of the journal so they really feel that ownership. If they're using that notebook, you can have them insert a page into the three-ring binder and have that decorated just so they feel that ownership. In addition to decorating the journal to feel ownership, you really want to establish the purpose and expectation with students. Here's an example of a contract that one teacher used. It explained the purpose of this journal and the rules, but what I like about this, it also explained why we have those rules. And then at the bottom, the student had to sign that they will abide by those rules. I would probably also have the parent sign and maybe even the teacher sign, just so all parties are involved and the parents realize how huge of a tool this is, and to expect that they might see it come home, and that we really need to take good care of this tool. Lastly, I wanted to touch on grades a little bit. I know a lot of teachers might take grades on a notebook, on the journal. My suggestion is that not so much grading it, because grades are kind of a reflection of what you've learned or that end product. Well, journals are really this ongoing process where we are still just grappling, still forming our ideas. It's this really informal tool where we're learning as we go. So I wouldn't suggest taking grades, but if you did want to do something, I would suggest maybe scoring each day's work just to give the students some sort of score. It might not be recorded towards a report card grade, but it does give students feedback on what they have or have not done. One suggestion for this is not to score based on have you mastered the concept or have you not mastered it, but my suggestion is to score on the effort put into the journal or what you as a teacher value as important in the journal. For example, showing work, communication, using vocabulary appropriately, attaching units to your answers, answering in complete sentences or checking your work, those types of things. So thinking about what you value and putting that in the rubric. I would also suggest that you put the rubric, after going through this with students and referring back to it throughout the year, I would suggest you glue this to the inside front cover or back cover of the journal so students always have this accessible. The good thing about the rubric is that it takes a little bit of the accountability off the teacher and puts it on the students. So students can then be asked when they're raising their hand saying, ooh, Miss Smith, I'm finished. The teacher could ask the students, well, go back and score yourself using that rubric. And that alleviates the teacher so that she's not constantly going back. And then once the students have written down a 3 or a 4, then she can look at the journal and give some feedback. Here's another example of a sample rubric. This might be more of a K1 or K2 example of a rubric. Well, now that we've talked about setting up journals for the beginning of the year and establishing expectations, I wanted you to take a minute to either talk with people in the room or pause and just reflect about which of these routines and expectations you would like to establish for math journals. So feel free to pause the video and then press play when you're ready. The next thing I wanted to discuss were just a couple formats for how you can use journals daily. Making sure that you don't feel stuck in just using one of these, but instead you want the journal to feel like this flexible tool that you can use in different ways depending on your lesson. So the first method, and you might have seen this one before, this is just the 4-block method. This is more for if you're giving students a word problem and you want them to do some grappling and some reflection as they solve the problem. So what this student did was, in the first block, she took some notes on the important information. The second block is where she visualized the problem using a drawing and some tally marks here. So the first block is taking notes. The second block would be some sort of drawn model or visualization. The third block is where you're getting more into that computation, so the symbolic notation or writing an equation. And then the last part is where you are writing a written explanation, and that's where you really get into that, that thinking about all of your steps that you used. So other than the 4-block method, my favorite strategy or my favorite way to use a journal is to use a 2-page spread. This way, everything that you do within your lesson is incorporated into that journal, and it's a good documentation of what you did throughout that day. So the first part of this on the right-hand side is where we would start out by giving the students some student work to do. So maybe at the beginning of the lesson, giving them a meaningful math task to grapple with, or an open-ended problem or problem of the day to grapple with. So that would be the beginning of the lesson. We always want to start off giving the students some time to pull in the strategies that they know. And then after giving the students some time for their work, then we're going to come in and teach the lesson and do the teacher input, which would be on the left-hand page, the left page. So here on the teacher input side, we might introduce a new strategy or a model, something related to that meaningful math task. So maybe that meaningful math task was on a multiplication problem or a repeated addition problem. So then that teacher input side might be related to, well, here's a new strategy like a math mountain for solving problems like this, or a number line for solving problems like this. And then the whole lesson would be built around that strategy. After the students grappled on the student work side, after the teacher gave her direct instruction and some guided practice on that teacher input side, there might be some independent practice or some reflection at the end of the lesson. And that would go down at the bottom left side. And something I like to do on this side is maybe say, okay, boys and girls, now that we've learned this new strategy or this new tool, I want you to resolve that meaningful math task using the new tool, and write how you did that in this bottom section here during that reflection section. I might also say, boys and girls, now that we've learned this new tool, I want you to tell me about one thing that you learned today, one question that you still have. And again, that would go in that bottom left section there. Let's take a look at some examples of this. Most teachers say to me, okay, I feel good about that student work section, that grappling section, but talk to me more about what that teacher input might look like. So here's a couple of examples. So it could be as simple as in kindergarten, as I teach students to say one number for each thing that they point to, I might give them a visual of that. Or counting by tens and some additional ones, I might give them a visual of that. And then that visual becomes the center of my lesson. I might teach students a new alternative algorithm for addition, and then my whole lesson would be around that. And then I would insert that tool in the teacher input section for students. This section, I'm just going to click through a couple of these images, but this section could also be where students might take notes. They might record some vocabulary. They might label a diagram using some color. There's a lot that could be really put in this teacher input section. Pretty much anything the teacher might be directly instructing on could go in this teacher input section. I wanted to give you an example of what this might look like in a kindergarten classroom, because pretty much if you can get this 2-page spread to work in kindergarten, you could probably get it to work anywhere. So what I did with this kindergarten class was I started out with giving them a math problem of the day. I read the problem to them, and then they had to solve it on the right side. After the students solved it, I pulled the students together on the carpet, and I taught them a new strategy for solving this problem. And I gave them Math Mountain work mats. The Math Mountain work mats just had a circle at the top of the mountain and then 2 circles for the parts at the bottom. And I gave the students chips, and we practiced finding different ways to add numbers on the Math Mountain. That was my whole lesson. Now, I was lucky. In this classroom, I had an assistant, so she was able to go around and glue the Math Mountain model in the students' journals as the students were on the carpet with me. And then she just drew that black line on their journals to separate where the remainder of their work space would be. So after the students did this whole lesson on how to use a Math Mountain, they brought their work mats back to their tables, and I told them, now that they've learned how to use a Math Mountain, let's see if we can represent on the Math Mountain the three apples and the 2 bees, and then move those objects together to find how many in all. So they used that Math Mountain to do that. And then lastly, I had them draw a picture of what that looked like in their journal. So this journal almost just becomes more of an interactive notebook where throughout the whole lesson, they're interacting somehow with the journal. One thing I've been telling kindergarten teachers is they're probably not going to feel super great about their journals because they're not going to be nearly as developed as any other grade. But this is a really good place still to start recording ideas. Even if the students are just recording a drawing of what they did that day. If they're using objects, they can record what that looked like then in a drawing. And that's huge too, because we really have to help students make the connection from objects to drawings, which is a great way to use the kindergarten journals. One caution that I wanted to make about the tools that you give during that teacher input section or the strategies, I want to make sure you realize only pick things that will deepen students' mathematical knowledge. We are developing their tool belt of knowledge, but those tools should be things that span across situations, across time. They're not just one quick trick that works only in one situation. Let me give you an example of this. I've seen a lot of teachers giving out these keyword posters or these keyword charts that students can glue into their journals. Now these might work fairly well in kindergarten or maybe first grade, but there's always going to be exceptions to these keywords. So we don't want to tell students that anytime you see the word altogether, you're going to add, because it could be in a subtraction problem or a multiplication problem. So just thinking about when you select tools and when you're teaching tools, think about the long range. If this is a really meaningful tool, this journal, students might hold on to it for several years, and then they might refer back to it later and realize, oh wait, well that tool only worked in that situation but doesn't really apply to me anymore. Let's take a look at some other ideas of some things that we could put in that 2-page spread on that teacher input side. This I've seen used a lot. Students would record a vocabulary word, the definition, and then under the word they would give an example. This teacher right here, she was teaching a lesson on triangles, and she figured, well, since I'm doing the lesson on triangles, I might as well have the students glue their triangles into their journal as a permanent record of what we did. So those were some examples for that 2-page spread, and hopefully you found that spread to be useful. Here's another example of what you could do. Some days I do just some sort of experiment with the students or some sort of big project with the students. And the 2-page spread probably won't work. Even the 4-block might not work. So this is when I pull out a KWPL chart. And I don't know if that's its official name, but I put P for developing a plan. So I would give the students a task and I would have them brainstorm all the things that they know, all the information that they know. And then I would have them go back to the task and think about, okay, so what are we trying to find out? And then they would make a plan. And usually this might be a small group type of activity, so the whole group has to decide on the plan and then execute the plan and then reflect on what they learned once they executed their plan. Let me give you a quick example of this. Here's an activity. This came from Math Expressions. This is a 4th grade activity. I would tell the students, imagine laying out all of the spaghetti noodles in the box end to end. You need to estimate how many meters long that long spaghetti noodle would be. Select a tool to help you. So what the students would do is they would first look at that box of spaghetti, write all the mathematical information that they know about that box of spaghetti. After they've done that, they've rephrased on that the W section what they're trying to find out. Then the group would come together and make a plan. And I have an example of some teachers from Van's story making this plan. So after they make their plan, they execute the plan, and then afterwards they would go back and reflect and record what they learned or the answer that they came up with. So that's just another way to use journals. All right, so we've talked a lot about the different suggestions for using journals or the different layouts for using journals on a daily basis. If you want, you can pause the video at this point and talk to other teachers or just reflect on a lesson that you've taught recently and how you could have used one of these formats within your lesson. And then when you're ready, you can just press play to continue. I wanted to touch on a couple other things that you could include with math journals, and I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. The first suggestion is foldables. I used to use a lot of foldables, and they really honestly just took a lot of time. You had to put a lot of time and effort into creating them, and you really want to think, if I'm putting that time into them, is there a good payoff? Well, I found when I used to use foldables there wasn't, because they would end up on the floor, they would have footprints all over them, or they would be ripped or shoved in the back of a cubby, and they never really served a long-term purpose, so it wasn't really effective. But one thing that you could do is, if you're going to spend all that time creating a foldable, then store it in the journal as a permanent record of what you did, and a tool for later study. Another suggestion is, if you're going to use thinking maps, have the students insert the thinking maps into their journal. What I used to do when I taught kindergarten and first grade, this was several years ago, but I would, after doing a shared writing of a journal, so have it on a big chart, I would then recopy the chart after class onto a smaller piece of paper and make photocopies of it and put it inside students' journals. That was a few years ago. Now we can easily just take a picture of the chart afterwards and insert a picture of that into the student's journal as a record of what we do. A lot of these ideas, they could be done as shared writing, and then the shared writing could be, a record of that shared writing could be put in that journal. Interactive tools. These are really great because a lot of the focus of Common Core is hands-on concrete learning and making those connections to those different tools. So a great idea is to store those tools inside the journal, making sure that if you do that, you might want to put your journals in a gallon-sized Ziploc bag so the tools don't fall out. Or if you move from unit to unit, maybe purging the tools that no longer apply to the other units and just saving the ones that would, just so the tools don't become jumbled up or fall out of the journal. One other thing that you might want to include in journals are writing prompts. If you do this, and this is pretty self-explanatory and pretty obvious, but if you do a writing prompt, try not to write a question that lends itself to a simple yes or no answer. Try to think of a how question or a why question, a more open-ended question, because if you ask a question like, can you, typically the answer will just be yes, and the students won't dig any deeper. And then the last thing that you could think about including are just some exit slips. And I'm sure you're probably already using some exit slips, but I just wanted to give you an example of some types of exit slips that you could possibly have at the end of your journal in that independent practice or reflection section if you were doing that 2-page spread. Alright, so we just talked a little bit about thinking maps and graphic organizers, word webs, foldables, interactive tools, writing prompts, and exit slips. I wanted you to have a chance to think about how you could use one of these or more of these in an upcoming lesson. So if you want, you can pause and talk with other teachers in your group, or you could pause and just have some self-reflection, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Next, I just wanted to touch upon something that's important, and this is something that I'm not seeing much in journals. I'm seeing teachers do a really great job of using journals as an interactive tool and a tool for reflection, but one thing I'm not seeing a lot is of teacher feedback. And I wanted to show what happens when you do give feedback to children. This student that I'm about to show you some work samples of, he was a 5th grade student. He was using journals pretty much for the first time in 5th grade. So the journal concept at this point in their school was a newer idea. And I just wanted to look at how the journal changed just between August and November. And you won't even need to read the samples, just kind of skim to see what the samples look like. So this first sample, this was done maybe first, second week of school, very end of August, and the student was just asked to explain his steps for how he solved a problem. So he did. He used 1 or 2 strategies here, and then he wrote a sentence or 2. This sample was from mid-September, so just a couple weeks later. Already the student was organizing his thinking, being a little bit more reflective, showing multiple strategies, and using different strategies for organizing and showing what he did, like using the arrows and using some different details here. So already we're getting a little bit more detail in the student thinking. So now just a couple months into the school, very beginning of November, this student here, or same student, now he is very detailed. His work is organized, he's super reflective, super detailed in his explanations. So it's just neat to see that progression within a couple of months, how more detailed that student's work is getting. What I wanted to point out about this, the reason this student's work became so detailed was the amount of teacher feedback this student was given. Every day the student was being told what he did well and what he understood, and then he was also being asked questions to dig deeper. So that student knew he was being held accountable for any work he put in a journal. even if you're not giving students feedback on a daily or even weekly basis, if they think they're being held accountable, if they think you're looking at these, they will continue to progress. So just be thinking about how you can get students to have feedback based on their journal. So let's just talk about some tips for providing feedback. Try to look at the journals weekly, and I know that might not be realistic, but hopefully you can try to at least look at the journals weekly. When you do look at them, make observations about what the students did understand, because remember, journals are this informal tool where students are just starting to reflect and starting to investigate things. So they're on the cusp of learning, but they don't always know what they did well versus what they might not grasp yet. So making observations about what they did understand. And then try to ask a question or two to get students to dig deeper. Ask students, well, how does this drawing connect to your equation? Or how could you have used a more efficient strategy? Or what were all the steps that you used? Or tell me more about the second thing that you did here. Making sure that students record all of their steps. Let's take a chance to practice giving some feedback. I'm going to show you a sample of student work. I want you to look through it and then just think about what this student did understand about the mathematics, what they did well, and then ask them a how question or a why question, or just a question to get them to dig a little bit deeper. One suggestion that I have about this is when you do give feedback, and I would really suggest trying to give written feedback. If you do give that feedback, one thing that you could do is have the journals who you did give feedback or where you did give feedback, have those journals on the students' desks in the morning, and as part of their morning routine, they would have to go back and answer whatever question that you ask. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this work sample. And again, just pause the video, identify one thing the student did understand or did do well, and then one question you might have for the student. Well, hopefully you had some ideas of what this student did well, what questions you could ask to dig deeper. So now that we've had a chance to think about feedback and the importance of feedback, let's take a look at what are some resources that we can use when we are using journals, and where can we pull some tools from. One big resource that I would suggest is using those meaningful math tasks on that student side of the 2-page spread, using these at the beginning of the class to grapple with, and making sure that whatever meaningful math task you select, the rest of your lesson connects to that task. So now that we've done that task, here's a tool we could use to solve tasks like that, or here's a strategy we could use to solve tasks like that. Hopefully you're also using the Cumberland County Resource Guide to pull resources from as you're teaching. But the tool that I wanted to focus on today was how we can use math expressions for that teacher input side of the 2-page spread. In every Math Expressions Teacher Edition, there are orange bordered pages at the beginning of the Teacher Edition. What's neat about this is you don't even need to read the whole book to figure out what tools you can pull from it. What I typically do is I will find, if I'm teaching a lesson on fractions, I will find the orange bordered section for the unit on fractions. And then I would just skim through and find some useful tools or strategies. And after I find the tools and strategies, for example, there's a bar model here, I might say to myself, okay, well, I need to know more. I'm not really sure how to use that. And then right next to the model, usually it identifies the lesson within the book that teaches that model. So then if you needed to, you could flip to that lesson. But what I do is I just photocopy that model, and then that becomes the thing that I put inside that teacher input page in the students' math journals. Another way to access those tools for Math Expressions, or that orange bordered page for Math Expressions, is by going to eduplace.com or eduplace.com. Once you're there, there's a couple common sense clicks that you would need to do. For example, you need to click on your state and then the content area, which obviously would be mathematics. Then you would also click on Math Expressions, obviously, and then you would need to click on your grade level. Once you're on your grade level, it gives you a couple of options. All of these are really useful options, but I wanted to show you the math background option first. The math background is that orange bordered section, just in a really nice, print-friendly version. So for every unit in math expressions, there's going to be an orange bordered section for it. For example, I clicked on the orange bordered section for Unit 3, and this is just a snapshot of part of that section. The nice thing about this is it gives you a really easy explanation of what the types of things are that students are learning. This is a great tool for you to copy and paste from for that teacher input section, but it's also a really neat thing to give to parents to help them understand those different strategies. So besides this math background section, there are a couple other places that you can explore on eduplace.com related to math expressions, and those are listed right here. One of my favorites is visual support. Those different visual models that I showed you on the teacher input section at the beginning of this PowerPoint, I pulled all of those visual models from this visual support section. And then the part called accessible algorithms is where I found all those different algorithms or strategies for teaching addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. And again, you could just click there, take screenshots of what they show you, and that can be your teacher input section. I appreciate you participating in the journaling PD, the journaling session that we did today. I wanted to give you a moment to either talk with other teachers in your group or have some time for self-reflection on how you are using journals in your classroom, and based on this PD, how you can plan to expand their use, or what other strategies that you can build into these journals. Again, thank you for participating in today's session. Have a great day.